Good morning. Okay, so a couple months ago, when we first planned out this sermon series, we were choosing who was going to do which weeks and stuff, and I said, well, I'm available these 2 weeks, and then they said, well, that's Sodom and Gomorrah and Abraham and Abimelech. And I went, oh, great. Okay, so I get the two hardest ones, and I have no idea what I'm going to do, but when I started preparing for this sermon a few weeks ago, I was going up to Boston for a work trip. I was on the airplane starting to do some sermon prep, and God actually showed me some things in this section on Abraham and Abimelech that actually made me start to cry for joy about how wonderful he is. I'm like, how is this going to happen with Abraham and Abimelech? But it's like, no, this is a very special section about God's grace and how he heals and how no matter how horrible we mess things up, he can make it right. He can make good out of it. And so, and that's one of the reasons why I chose to title this one, The Path of Faith, Sanctification. So that's a big word, so I decided, okay, I better define that word. Sanctification is the process of making us holy or set apart. It's how God takes us from where we are and makes us into who he wants us to be. It's taking this rough stone and chipping away all of our junk and chipping away at us to make us into how he wants us to be and how he wants to use us. And one of the things that we're going to learn in this section is that Abraham's got some big chunks that he needs chipped off. And we're going to see how God takes some of these big chunks and chips them off of Abraham and gets him ready to do some things that Ben's going to get to preach about the next 2 weeks. That God has to prepare Abraham to get ready to do what he wants him to do. And we're going to see this preparation that God's going to make what he wants to make out of this. He's going to take Abraham and turn him into who he wants him to be. So let's start off in chapter 20. So from there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. So we've got a lot of places and things. So the first thing we have to do is figure out from where. From there. It says from there. Now, the weird thing is that this is in 20 verse 1, but Abraham is not in the end of 19. So we have to go back a little farther to see where the from there is. And so I brought a handy-dandy map. So the from there is Hebron. And yeah, my hands are shakier than yours, I think. So the Hebron is from there. Hebron, you often see it in the book of Genesis as the oaks of Mamre. Mamre was someone that they attributed these oaks to. And that's sort of the base that Abraham operates out of for most of his life. It's at that spot in Hebron that Abraham has just met with the Lord and the two angels, and they promise him a son. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. But it's from that spot up in Hebron, up there, that Abraham receives this promise, and it's from that spot that he sees the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. One thing that's interesting, Hebron, if you notice it's brown around that's because that's a mountain. You're up on a high elevation mountain area, and you can look over the Dead Sea. So you've got a mountain above the lowest place on earth. So it's a big drop off. And so from there you can see this destruction coming up in the skies. And so that's where Abraham's coming from. Now, where he's going, it says, is that basically he starts up here in Hebron, and he travels down here between Kadesh and Shur, and then he ends up sojourning in Gerar. So we don't know why he's traveling. Some of the theories is he's a shepherd. So what do you have to do with sheep? Sometimes you have to move the sheep to better pastures. The other thing is this area has an issue with water, and we're going to see that towards the end as well. And so it's quite possible that the water level in Hebron was getting low, and he went down to other places where there was more water available. And so that's quite possible. But anyways, he's made it to this place in Gerar, which is a place where evidently he hasn't been before. And we'll see that in verse 2. So he ends up in Gerar, and Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, "She is my sister." And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. So, where have we seen this before? We've seen this before in chapter 12 when Abraham went to Egypt, is that she is my sister. So evidently, he hasn't been there before because Abimelech doesn't know that she was not his sister, but instead his wife. So this is evidently the first time he's been there. And we see that this has happened before in chapter 12. When he went down to Egypt, he said to Pharaoh, "Hey, this is my sister," and Pharaoh took her, and we ended up with a mess. Jeremy got to preach on that several weeks ago. And so you think, hey, this is a big issue. This is something that Abraham has trouble with. This is not the first time he's done this. Thankfully, this is the last time that we know that he did this. However, his son actually does it with Abimelech's son. So it's not that this is the end. This is going to show up again in the book of Genesis. So this is a huge sin that Abraham's going to be grappling with that God needs to take care of. And sometimes there's sins in our lives that just keep recurring that God needs to take care of. And it's not going to be an easy process. It's going to be a painful process. And that's what we're going to focus on today, is that process. Now, if we look at this in verse 2, it says, okay, this sounds just like the problem in Egypt, right? Except that one thing's different. It's much worse. And the reason it's much worse is because back in chapter 17, this is what God said to Abraham. God said, "No, but Sarah, your wife." He's trying to make it so that Ishmael can be his descendant that the promise goes through. And he says, "No, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him." So that's in Genesis 17. And then in 18, God comes again. This is up in Hebron where he actually comes in physical form and talks with Abraham. And the Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son." Okay, so what's the problem here? God's promised him, you're going to have a son through Sarah next year. And what does Abraham do? He gives his wife away to someone else. How is he going to have a son? How is this going to be a legitimate heir? Who's the daddy? We need to know that. We need to make sure that this is a descendant of Abraham, not a descendant of Abimelech. How is God going to fix this? This is a huge issue. And so often the process of sanctification begins with sin. It's often in those struggles that when we pray for him to heal us, it's often that the first thing that happens is we do something wrong, or we get a difficult situation thrown into our lives. So sin is what happens when we don't trust God. It's what happens when we miss the mark. And Abraham right now is not trusting God. He's not trusting him in a big way. This seems like, okay, God's going to say, okay, Abraham, you've done it. You've gone too far. You're gone. I'm going to do something else. Thankfully, that's not what happens. This is one of those times where Abraham goes in a direction that is about as bad as you can go. I can't imagine doing any worse, but God comes in and gets involved. This is one of those where it's a but God situation, and God intervenes in this situation. He doesn't leave Abraham in this sin. He doesn't allow his promise to have issues with it. He is going to jump into this. And we're going to see exactly how that's done in verses 3 through 7. So, but God came to Abimelech in a dream by night. So notice God's not going to Abraham and saying, hey, you messed up. Sometimes he does that. But in this case, God goes to Abimelech, this person who's not part of the promise, in a dream and said to him, behold, you are a dead man. And this idea of death is going to pop up again and again. This chapter is all about life and death, and that God holds both of them in his hands, and that sin brings about death. But notice who's the dead man? Who made the big mistake? Abraham made the big mistake. But who's the dead man? Abimelech. I still haven't quite got my head around that one. But it says, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman who you have taken, for she is a man's wife. Now, Abimelech had not approached her, so this is really important because we need to know that Isaac is a descendant of Abraham, not a descendant of Abimelech. So, Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, Lord, will you kill an innocent people? So one thing that jumped out at me when I was studying this is that doesn't say, Lord, will you kill an innocent person? Will you kill an innocent people? One thing that's interesting is throughout this chapter that when Abimelech makes a decision, it affects his whole people. When you're a leader of your family, when you make a decision and do something wrong, you are not just affecting yourself, you're affecting your children. So he said, Lord, will you kill innocent people? Did Abraham not himself say to me, she is my sister, and she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I have done this. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. So this is one of those times where this situation is a life or death situation. God's saying, this is a big deal. Do it now or you're going to die. It's not big. But God worked through Abimelech. He was willing to go to Abimelech. And one of the amazing things is Abimelech was willing to listen. So this process of sanctification that we're going to see is that it's not straight between God and Abraham, that God works on Abraham through Abimelech. So sometimes it's going to be through outside things that bring about the healing that we need. And so let's go on and see what Abimelech did. So Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all these things. And the men were very much afraid. So they were fearing what had happened. They actually believed Abimelech. They believed the dream. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done." And Abimelech said to Abraham, "What did you see that you did this thing?" Abraham said, "I did it because I thought, there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife." So let's take that for a second before I go on. There's no fear of God at all in this place. Who feared God in this situation? Abimelech. Who didn't fear God? Abraham. So Abraham's worried because he's not trusting God. So he definitely did this out of a lack of fear of God. How do we not fear God? What do we forget to fear God when we think we've got it in control, or when we see the stuff around us and that looks bigger than this God that's taking care of us. Remember, Abraham just saw God destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. There should have been fear of God in Abraham, because this is right after that. This is right after that situation that Abraham should have said, hey, God cares about purity of marriage. He cares about this promise that he's given me, and he has the power to do it. And yet Abraham forgot. And so often we forget as well. So let's continue on. So this is where we learn his plan. Besides, she is indeed my sister, so he wasn't lying. How often do we do this? Oh, okay, I sort of misled you, but I wasn't really lying to you. We can justify our own choices. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. So before we get into this whole thing of, okay, we got a problem here because they're like half siblings. This was a lot more common back in that day and age. There were a lot fewer people, there was less genetic issues, and so it doesn't really get into whether or not that is a good thing. Also, remember, Abraham and Sarah got married before they even knew God. So we're not going to get into the details. That is definitely not a marriage that we would want to have nowadays. And later on, throughout the law, God actually says, do not do this. But at this point, we're not going to deal with the marrying your half-sibling, but don't do it. Just don't go there. Okay, so she became my wife, and then it said, and when God caused me to wander, so God caused him to wander, he called him to wander, from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness you must do to me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother. So what we see here is that Abimelech confronts Abraham. So this process of sanctification in this situation is that Abraham has this horrible sin. God intervenes to heal. And part of the process of the healing is a confrontation. Now, how would you like to be either Abraham or Abimelech in this situation? You're Abimelech and you're having to return this wife to this person that lied to you. You're Abraham who's been caught in a lie. Neither of these are good. Confrontation about sin is never pleasant. Good things come of it, but the process is hard. But we need to do it. We need to be willing to confront one another about sin in their lives and be confronted about sin in our lives. And the way that we need to do that is to love each other. If you confront for the sake of making them better, the way that you think that they should be better, it doesn't work very well. If you confront them because you love them and you want them to seek God, that's how healing happens. And so the way that we confront is really important. And it's that confrontation that can bring about the healing that comes next. So this healing is something that God provides. So let's look at what happens next. So then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants and gave them to Abraham and returned Sarah his wife to him. So this is one of those interesting situations where Abraham's the one that's really at fault, but Abimelech's the one that's having to pay for it. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes there's one person that's at fault and someone else has to pay for it and hurts from it. It's really unfortunate, but that happens. So when we sin, we have to sometimes remember, hey, this isn't about me. When I make a mistake, who's going to pay for this? Is it just me or is it going to be the people around me? So Abimelech took a bunch of sheep and oxen, and Abraham comes out wealthy because of this mistake, just like he did in Egypt. This thing's turning out pretty good for him. Hopefully he won't do it again. And he doesn't, but his son does. But he returns Sarah, his wife, to him, and Abimelech said, "Behold, my land is before you. Dwell where it pleases you." So this is the land that God had promised. This is the land of Canaan. This is where God said, this is your land, but you don't get to claim it yet. Your descendants will in about 400 years. And Abimelech saying, here, you can live anywhere you want. Dwell. This is part of the healing process. Notice, if I was Abimelech, I would have been furious with Abraham, and I would have said, get out of here, and I don't want to ever see you again. But somehow God's grace, he gave Abimelech the ability to forgive. And he gave Abimelech the ability to heal the relationship and to bring in this reconciliation between them. This process of healing is very hard, but we need to be willing to do it. Abimelech had been wronged. Sometimes we are severely wronged, and it's really hard to forgive. When you work through that process of forgiveness, if you can do it you're with you and God, that's great. If you need someone to walk through that forgiveness with you, please seek other people. If you're in a shepherding group leaders would probably love to do this. I know elders, we love to help reconcile. If there's issues where you've been wronged and you want to have forgiveness in that situation and get things right, please call, ask for help. That's something that we as a church strive for, is reconciliation. So work on it. It's going to be painful, and sometimes the person that we think is doing the wrong doesn't have to make the first step. Sometimes someone else makes the first step. So, Abimelech says, live wherever you want. But then he talks to Sarah. And he said, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Just to give you an idea of how much that is, that's the price for 20 brides. So, instead of paying Abraham to have a bride, he's paying Abraham to take his own wife back, and he's paying the equivalent of 20 brides in order to do so. So it is a sign of your innocence. So to Sarah, this is saying you are innocent in the eyes of all who are with you. And before everyone, you are vindicated. This is really important for us to know. Isaac did not come from Abimelech. But Isaac is the son of the promise through Sarah from Abraham. So you are vindicated. And then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech. And also healed his wife and female slaves so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. So this is one of the many places in the book of Genesis where we see that God is in charge of life and death. That he opens wombs and he closes wombs. He allows them to have children, and he keeps them from having children. But that God healed Abimelech. So when they heal with each other and God's healing, this is reconciliation all the way around. This is what Keith was talking about during communion, is that God has reconciled us to him and gave us the ministry of reconciliation with each other. That we need to be willing to accept the healing from God and to offer the healing and the reconciliation to one another. It's not easy, but it needs to be done. You see, what could have been something that caused a war between the household of Abraham and the household of Abimelech actually leads to something that causes the two people to get along and to have a mutual respect for each other. God took something that was horrible and that could have caused catastrophe and turned it into something good. And we see that in chapter 21, toward the end of 21. So I'm skipping over what we're going to talk about next week. And the reason is that in chapter 21, this is about probably 4 or 5 years later, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. So this healing that happened there affects them later on. And so this is continuing, and this relationship continues to build. And the reason that it continues to build is because Abraham seems to have turned a corner. God is with you in all that you do. And he says, now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my descendants or with my posterity. But as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal with me and with the land where you have sojourned. And Abraham said, I swear. So Abimelech's probably still remembering what happened 5 years earlier. And he says, hey, swear to me you're going to act honestly. We dealt with an issue where you lied to me, but from now on, swear that you're going to act honestly. And Abraham said, yes, I will. And then he said, okay, so let me talk to you about something that popped up. So he says, okay, we got this relationship. Now, let me just bring up an issue. There's this well that I dug. And Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech. And the two men cut a covenant. Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 lambs that you have set apart? And he said, these 7 lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for me that I dug this well. Therefore that place was called Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath. So just a little aside, the word Beersheba either means the well of the oath or the well of the 7, because oath and 7 are basically the same word in Hebrew, or they're very, very similar. So either way, this is referring to the oath or the 7 lambs that were part of the oath. So because they both swore an oath, so they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. And Abraham planted a tree, a tamarisk tree in Beersheba. So Abraham is setting down roots here. And called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. So this is so what came out of this, out of the healing, is that Abraham's able to live in holiness. He's able to live in the way that God intended him to live. He's able to live in a relationship with the people around him. And this place of Beersheba comes up again and again throughout the book of Genesis and also later on. This is a place where Abraham says God has come, and that talks about who God is. That what could have caused a catastrophe, God came in and rescued. How many times do we think, okay, we have caused a catastrophe. We have made a mistake that there's no way that God can fix this. And that was why when I was preparing the sermon that I was just in tears of joy, was that God can take whatever mistakes I make and whatever mistakes you make, and he can turn them into something beautiful. Amen. And that he can heal. All we have to do is accept his gift of healing. There is nothing that you have done that is beyond what God can heal. That he can take our mistakes, he can take our sin, and he can turn it into a process of healing that brings about his glory. It's not going to be easy, it's going to be painful, but it's exactly what he wants it to be. So, as we close today, please spend some time praying. What is God wanting to heal you of? How is he wanting to reconcile himself to you? How is he wanting you to reconcile with someone else? As we sing our last songs, there will be people to pray in the back. If you need help through this process and you need someone to pray for you, please pray. So let me close in prayer. God, thank you for your healing. Thank you for taking our junk and turning it into something beautiful. God, I pray that you would help us to see honestly what is in our lives. God, I pray that you would intervene, that you would allow the healing to occur that you want to occur, and that you would chip away those huge chunks in our lives that are holding us back from who you have designed us to be. And it's only through your Son that we can pray this. Amen.